The Ruy Lopez Berlin defense is one of the most solid openings that black can play against e4. Vladimir Kramnik used it as his primary weapon to win a world championship match against the legendary Garry Kasparov in the year 2000. After this surprising result, the Berlin defense has become a popular and reliable defense to e4 at the highest levels of chess. We reached the Berlin defense after e4, e5. Both sides control their fair share of the center, and white now develops a piece and adds pressure to black's center with knight f3. Black defends the center and centralizes a knight with knight c6. White has many choices at this point, but turns the game into the popular Ruy Lopez opening with bishop b5. Adding pressure against black's knight, which is the key defender of the e5 square. The traditional main line of the Ruy Lopez is a6, attacking white's bishop immediately, but we reach the Berlin defense with the natural-looking knight f6, developing a piece and counterattacking white's center. Before we continue our journey, it's important to understand that white cannot win material with bishop takes c6, doubling black's pawns and removing the guard of e5, as black can play d takes c6, opening up the queen on the d-file as well as black's light-squared bishop. If white tries to grab a pawn with knight takes e5, black has the powerful double attack, queen d4, attacking the knight and preparing queen takes e4 check on the next move with a great position, so white's premature pawn grab has backfired. After black plays knight f6, reaching the Berlin defense, white is at a crossroads. White can defend the center with d3, which we'll examine later, or else white can continue to develop rapidly with kingside castling, inviting black to capture the e4 pawn, which black accepts with knight takes e4. White temporarily sacrifices a pawn, using the time advantage to strike in the center with d4. In this mainline variation of the Berlin defense, white is already castled, developed two minor pieces, and is attacking black's center. Black should avoid losing more time by capturing the d4 pawn with e takes d4. Black has captured a pawn, but has cleared the e-file of pawns, allowing white to play the highly unpleasant move, rook e1, pinning black's knight to the king, which will not be able to escape the center anytime soon, so white enjoys a strong initiative. Instead of opening up the center, black's main idea is to attack white's bishop with the strange-looking knight move, knight d6, attacking white's bishop and moving away from the dangerous e-file. This move invites white to head toward the treacherous Berlin endgame with bishop takes c6, surrendering the bishop pair but doubling black's pawns. Black rarely captures with b takes c6, as this also doubles black's c-pawns but creates an isolated a7 pawn, so after white plays d takes e5, black will have a difficult defense ahead. Black's main response is by far d takes c6, opening up the queen on the d-file as well as black's light-squared bishop. After white captures the e5 pawn with d takes e5, attacking the knight and opening up the d-file, black's knight moves to safety with knight f5, eyeing the d4 square and observing the kingside. The first time you see this position, you may wonder if black is a relatively inexperienced player. After all, black offers a trade of queens, forfeiting the right to castle, but as we'll see, things are far from clear. White should trade queens immediately, because if white plays queen e2, trying to avoid the Berlin endgame, we can see the strength of black's knight on f5 after the move knight d4. Black has equalized the game, as white's direct attempt to refute black's setup with knight takes d4, queen takes d4, and rook d1 completely backfires. It looks like white is creating a strong attack, but is in for an unpleasant surprise after bishop g4, skewering the queen to the rook, so white is forced to allow a trade of queens under less favorable circumstances than the main line. After knight f5, if white wants to challenge black's play, the only choice is to enter the Berlin endgame with queen takes d8 check, forcing king takes d8. We have now reached the Berlin endgame, which is technically a queenless middle game. This is also known as the Berlin Wall, especially after Kasparov failed to break down Kramnik's defenses in their match. In order to enter the Berlin Wall, black has lost castling rights and has a compromised pawn structure on the queen side. Let's imagine all of the pieces disappearing for a moment to better understand the pawn structure. We've cleared the board of all of the pieces, including the kings, which is of course an illegal position, but the main point is for us to examine the pawn structure. White has a 4 versus 3 pawn majority on the king side. Black, on the other hand, has the same pawn majority on the queen side. The difference is that Black's 4 versus 3 pawn majority on the queen side has doubled c-pawns. This means that Black's pawn majority is unable to create a passed pawn by itself. White's pawn majority, however, can create a passed pawn, starting with f4, and if necessary, h3 and g4 to help prepare f5. Once these moves are made, White's pawn majority can force a passed pawn with e6. Of course, it all depends on where the other pieces are placed to decide if e5 to e6 is a good idea, but this is a key resource for White that we have to keep in mind at all times. So far, we've mentioned Black's king is stuck in the center, and White has a 4 versus 3 pawn majority on the king side, which can create a dangerous passed pawn. With these points in mind, why would Black possibly want to defend the Berlin Wall? White has surrendered the bishop pair with bishop takes c6, and in order to enter this position, White was forced to advance the e4 pawn to e5. This move prevents the knight from advancing to an active post on e5, and it also seriously weakens the light squares as it is no longer able to protect d5 and f5. This suggests that Black's light-squared bishop is potentially a powerful piece as it can take advantage of these weak light squares. The advanced e5 pawn will prove to be a target, and it's not uncommon for Black to play knight e7 with the idea of moving the knight to g6, adding pressure to this pawn. If White could open up the center quickly, Black's king would be exposed, but it's difficult for White to achieve this goal. If White immediately attacks Black's king with rook d1 check, Black needs to be careful and avoid playing bishop d7, which allows a typical trap after knight g5, attacking the vulnerable f7 square and threatening to fork the king and rook. After Black tries to defend the pawn and unpin the light-squared bishop with king e8, Black's king is now overworked, as it cannot both protect the light-squared bishop as well as the f7 pawn. So White has the tactical shot, knight takes f7. And if Black captures the knight, White crashes through Black's defenses with rook takes d7 check, when the Berlin Wall is starting to fall apart. After rook d1 check, Black's king needs to return to e8. When Black can make the argument that White's rook is misplaced on d1, not only does it get in the way of centralizing the other rook, it can also be argued that White's rook is better placed on f1, where it can help support a future f4 and possibly f5 expansion. This rook may also find a home on e1, where it can help support the advance of the e-pawn. Notice that White gains nothing from trying to continue to attack Black's king with bishop g5, threatening rook d8 checkmate, as Black can simply play bishop e6, centralizing the bishop and revealing the rook's defense of d8. Black's centralized light-squared bishop cannot be harassed with knight g5 since White's bishop is in the way, so White's play has failed to challenge the Berlin Wall. Instead of playing rook d1 check, White's most popular moves include knight c3, as well as h3, preparing to grab space on the king side with g4. Black has several choices, including the currently popular king e8, contesting the g4 square with h5, and Black can even play bishop d7. Kramnik played this move in his 2000 World Championship match. One of Black's biggest challenges in the Berlin is coordinating the back rank, especially connecting the rooks, as Black's king stands in the way. Bishop d7 allows the interesting idea of playing king c8, when Black will play b6, followed by king b7, moving the king off the back rank, so once Black develops the dark-squared bishop, Black's rooks will be connected. This is an interesting idea to keep in mind. h3 is a useful move, supporting an eventual g4, but there's no rush for White to play g4. One popular setup for White is to play knight c3, followed by fianchettoing the dark-squared bishop with b3 and bishop b2. If White grows impatient and tries to attack immediately with g4, we can see how Black can simply absorb White's energy and prepare a timely counterstrike. Black's knight retreats to safety with knight e7. Black will often spend a tempo moving the knight to this square, preparing to maneuver it to g6, adding pressure to the e5 pawn. With the knight on e7, knight d5 is also a possibility if necessary. White charges ahead with knight g5, attacking f7 and clearing the path for f4 and f5, a common idea for white in the Berlin. It turns out trying to force this plan immediately does not work out well for white. Black's king should defend the pawn with king e8. White continues with the direct plan of kingside expansion with f4. It looks like white is gaining a quick initiative by mobilizing the pawn majority, but black has the instructive counterstrike, h5. If white continues to push forward with f5, black opens the h-file with h takes g4. If white plays h takes g4, then black will attack the now backward g4 pawn with rook h4. White can continue to charge forward with e6, and after black calmly responds with f takes e6, f takes e6, and bishop c8. White has pushed black backwards, but white's position will prove overextended after h takes g4, rook h4, threatening to capture the g4 pawn with check, forking the king and knight. If white tries to defend the pawn with rook f4, black's pieces come to life with knight d5, attacking white's rook when black's dark-squared bishop is ready to join the action with a move such as bishop d6 or bishop c5. White's rook does not have a stable square on the fourth rank, and after rook e4, knight f6, forking white's rook and pawn on g4, when white's overextended position is beginning to collapse. It's important to know if black plays properly, white's overly aggressive methods will not break down the Berlin Wall. White's most popular continuation in the Berlin Wall is to play knight c3. The knight develops to an active square and may use the e4 square to centralize this piece, one of the benefits of white's pawn moving to e5. At this point, black has several options to consider. Black can move the light-squared bishop to d7, with the idea of playing king c8, continuing with b6 and king b7. Black can also consider h6, preventing any knight g5 ideas, and preparing to centralize the light-squared bishop with bishop e6. Black's king is by no means committed to the queen side, and black can play king e8, remaining in the center and keeping a close eye on white's kingside pawn majority. On a very good day, likely with more pieces exchanged, black's king may march up the board with king e7 and king e6 to add pressure to the target on e5. Black's knight on f5 can stay on that square or decide to move to e7, followed by knight g6, adding more pressure to e5. Black's rooks can prove difficult to activate, so black can consider expanding on the flanks with h5 and a5, and in some cases, h4 and a4, when black's rooks may find ways to enter the game from these files. White, on the other hand, also enjoys great flexibility. The dark-squared bishop can support e5 with bishop f4, move to g5, or commit to the popular plan of a queenside fianchetto with b3 and bishop b2. White can centralize the rooks and prepare h3, g4, as well as f4, and when timed properly, f5 and e6 can be an idea for white to consider. As we can see, there are no shortage of ideas on either side of the Berlin Wall. After black plays knight d6, instead of the main line bishop takes c6, white can play a tricky, but ultimately harmless sideline, d takes e5, allowing black to capture the bishop with knight takes b5. The point is that black's knight is trapped after a4. Black can consider playing d6 or knight takes e5, as well as the straightforward knight b to d4. In order to regain the sacrifice piece, white needs to simplify the position with knight takes d4, knight takes d4, and queen takes d4. It looks like white is taking over the position, but black can strike in the center, just in time, with d5. Black has a reasonable position, and if white opens the center with e takes d6, black can play the solid queen takes d6, offering a trade of queens when the position is quite balanced. If white is looking to avoid the main lines after d4, a relatively popular sideline is rook e1, adding pressure down the e-file. Black responds in typical Berlin style with knight d6, attacking the bishop and often preparing to move the knight to f5. Instead of moving the bishop immediately, White can play knight takes e5. White's bishop appears to be hanging on b5, but this would allow knight takes c6 check, discovering the white rook's check against black's king, when black will lose the queen. Instead of falling for this trap, black should continue to develop and protect the exposed king with bishop e7. White can decide to trade knights with knight takes c6, but black has a solid game after d takes c6, gaining a tempo against white's bishop and opening up the light-squared bishop. One tricky move that is sometimes played is bishop d3, although this does block the d-pawn. And many grandmasters have experimented with bishop f1, preserving the light-squared bishop, and white can prepare to play d4 and possibly grab space with d5, but it's difficult to prove an advantage in this symmetrical structure. One common way for black to continue is knight takes e5, rook takes e5, and castles kingside. White can take space in the center with d4, when after bishop f6, white's rook does not have a more stable placement than to return to e1. Black can now improve the knight's placement with knight f5, attacking the d4 pawn and preparing to move the d-pawn to grab space in the center and complete development. Black has a solid position and should not have any particular problems from the opening. If white decides not to castle, the most popular alternative is the solid d3, securing the center and avoiding simplifications. Black's most common and active response is bishop c5. White sometimes decides to play bishop takes c6, but not with the intention of winning a pawn. After d takes c6, white commonly plays knight b to d2, with possible ideas such as adding more pressure to black's center with knight c4, or sometimes white moves this knight to the kingside with knight f1, when the knight can move to g3 or possibly e3. One thing's clear, white should not try to win a pawn with knight takes e5, as black can punish this greedy move with queen d4, attacking the knight and threatening queen f2, checkmate. Black has two pieces guarding g4. White cannot both defend the knight and prevent checkmate, so white is losing a piece. Instead of playing bishop takes c6, if white castles, this allows black the additional option of playing knight d4, avoiding doubled c-pawns and creating reasonable chances for black. If white wants to avoid this possibility, then white will play c3, preventing knight d4, and in some cases, preparing central expansion with d4. Black now has several choices, including playing the solid d6, remaining flexible with kingside castling, or even striking the center immediately, potentially gambiting a pawn with d5. If white plays e takes d5, then black will centralize the queen with queen takes d5. White can decide to secure the center with knight b to d2, or even consider playing knight takes e5, adding pressure to black's pinned knight on c6. Black can now move the king to safety with kingside castling. Black enjoys a lead in development, and white needs to be careful. If white plays bishop takes c6, b takes c6, black's strong lead in development compensates for the sacrificed pawn, and if white tries to get greedy by capturing another pawn with knight takes c6, black can respond strongly with queen d6, activating the queen and forcing white to lose more time by retreating the knight, when black can start to open up the game with d takes e4, enjoying a strong initiative. The Berlin defense is a strategically rich, flexible opening. In the Berlin endgame, also known as the Berlin Wall, black forfeits the right to castle and allows white an active 4 versus 3 pawn majority on the kingside. Black willingly accepts this position thanks to the bishop pair, especially the light-squared bishop, which can highlight white's light-squared weaknesses. The advanced e5 pawn will prove to be a target, hoping to prove it's more of a liability than an asset for white. If you typically enjoy non-forcing, positionally complex play, then the Berlin defense may be the opening for you.